My name is June Casey, and on behalf of the Harvard Law School Library, I'd like to invite you to today's book talk. We are here to celebrate the three lives of James Madison, genius, partisan, president, and released this month by Random House Publishers. And I can tell you, I just got my copy this past week, and I have an ethical dilemma. I know I have to put this in the faculty bookcase, but I also want to take it home to read it. Just the photographs alone.
You can take it home to read it and then put it in the faculty bookcase. It's a simple solution.
It might take a while. It is actually a hefty volume, but I want to let you know that the coop is in the back of the room with copies for you to take home as well. So today we have our author, Professor Noah Feldman, who is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law and Director of the Julis-Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli Law. Our panelists include our guest, Professor David Armitage, who is the Harvard University Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History. We also have Professor Bruce Mann, who is the Harvard Law School Carl F. Schipper Jr. Professor of Law, and another guest, special guest, Professor Eric Nelson, who is the Harvard University's Robert M. Beren Professor of Government. So before we get started, I have just a quick reminder for you. As the sign says, today's talk is going to be recorded, and any remarks that you make during the question and answer period will be recorded, and the talk will be posted on YouTube about a week or so after today's talk. Thank you for joining me, and today, I'll now pass the microphone over to our panel.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to the Law School Library for organizing this great event, and to all of you for coming out. I'm really grateful to you, and I'm glad there's room for everybody in the room, and I hope people will make room for people who look like they need seats to sit down. I'm going to be extremely brief. I, first of all, just want to really express my deep appreciation to my colleagues and friends who are here. They're still my friends because the comments haven't happened yet, to discuss and comment on the book. I wrote it simply because I'm a constitutional law person, and Madison is, to my mind, the most significant single figure in the history of the United States with respect to constitutional thought, and one of the handful of most significant figures globally and historically in that same respect. I am not a professional historian of late 18th and early 9th century United States. Consequently, I had a very, very, very steep learning curve, and I worked extraordinarily hard. I learned a great deal, and I am certain that I'm about to learn many things, including things that I ought to have learned before having sat down to write the book. The book is roughly divided into three parts, and its central argument is that Madison's own intellectual career can be productively divided with respect to its internal tensions into three distinct periods. In the first, he sought to produce a constitution under the framework of hoping to produce something that would facilitate reasoned conversation without political partisanship, that would unify the country more effectively than it had previously been unified. I have many, many details on that, and I think new arguments about the structure of how it happened in the book, but that's the overarching picture of his first life. In his second life, he discovered that the goal had been evanescent. Notwithstanding the ratification of the Constitution, he discovered that there was deep, fundamental, and inevitably partisan disagreement that had to occur because he did not simply think that his opponents, predominantly those surrounding Alexander Hamilton, were wrong about policy. He thought that they were actually trying to subvert the Constitution and the idea of republicanism itself. So having produced a nonpartisan Constitution, he then went and produced a deeply partisan political structure, a political party indeed, with Thomas Jefferson, thereby inaugurating a mode of deep political partisanship in the United States that crucially involved the Constitution itself. And that's why, I argue, in the United States, we engage in this particularly strange phenomenon where we constantly say how much we value bipartisanship and how sad we are about how partisan our country is. And then, in almost the same breath, we condemn our political opponents for subverting the Constitution. So that's a very strange combination. I think it looks very weird if you look at us from the outside. And Madison, I think, and I argue, is a significant figure in inaugurating both of those distinct features. In his third life, Madison set out to do for foreign policy what he had already done for the domestic constitution. That is, he wanted to create a republican foreign policy that would enable a republic, that is to say, an entity without a standing army and with no navy to speak of, to coerce foreign actors to do what he wanted them to do, what the United States wanted them to do. His goal was to use economic sanctions to do that. He came very, very, very close to succeeding, but ultimately found himself launching the War of 1812 because his theory was not quite good enough. This was another period of radical retrenchment for him. The war went very badly, and then ultimately by really essentially, well, I would say it's partly a stroke of luck and partly the fact that it's much easier to defend a country with militia than it is to invade a country with militia. The United States survived the War of 1812, and Madison ended his life as a bipartisan hero, primarily by virtue of having gone to war and not lost the Republic in the process. That's the structure of the book, and you will hear no more from me until after my colleagues have spoken, in which case I might be able to offer a word or two of comment, and now I'm going to turn the floor over to them. Have you decided in which order you wish to speak?
No, but
Alphabetical.
I'll go last.
Alphabetical.
All right, David Armitage.
That's how we're sitting.
Thank you so much again to Harvard Law School for organizing this, but thanks most of all, of course, to Noah for the enormous gift of his book, and also more contingently for providing the perfect segue to the beginning of my remarks. I want to begin in the War of 1812, somewhere very far from where we sit now, and indeed very far from the places that are occupied by James Madison during his life and during his biography. He was a remarkably under-traveled man with a remarkably cosmopolitan, indeed global viewpoint, like many of the founding fathers. But one incident that I'm pretty sure he wasn't aware of happened in November 1813 in the midst of the War of 1812, when a 33-year-old New Englander called David Porter was tasked with defending U.S. naval interests in the Pacific against British shipping. And in the course of that process, he found himself in the Marquesas Islands. Bear with me, we're getting to Madison in a moment. He found himself in the Marquesas Islands, where he took possession of one of the islands, Nukuhiva. He set up a small fortified settlement with the initial accord of the local indigenous people, the Typee, more famous for being written about by Herman Melville, founded a settlement over which he ran up the Stars and Stripes, fired a 13-gun salute, made a declaration of U.S. possession, and then named this settlement Madisonville on the island of Madison's Island. Why did he do this, apart from the strategic necessity of doing that in the global context of the War of 1812, something we forget when we think of it as purely hemispheric in the Americas? He did this because he said at the time that the Marquesan Islanders, the Typee in particular, had, quotes, requested to be admitted into the American family. And he reciprocated on that occasion by saying that he thought they were very appropriate members of the American family because of what he thought of as their attachment to what he called pure Republican policy. And I mention this not just as a colorful anecdote, and not only because of Madison's probable ignorance about this global moment, but in fact to point up the global importance of Madison himself, and also the remarkably rapid, truly global, meaning inter-hemispheric, trans-regional, transoceanic spread of this American ideal, which Noah very persuasively argues was attributable in very large part to Madison himself, both through his initial genius as the only begetter of at least the original version of the Constitution as we recognize it now, but also as its greatest promoter and defender through the three phases of his life. That by 1813, even Pacific Islanders could engage in a dialogue, an intercultural dialogue about some of these ideals, which would have been inconceivable 30 or 40 years before. And that a settlement could be founded in the name of the then president, Madison himself. The ending of this particular episode is rather less glorious than the ending of Madison's own life, that after a few weeks, the local civil wars descended into conflict with the Americans themselves. The Typee accused the Americans of being the posteriors to the private parts of their enemies, attacked them and ultimately drove them out. And that particular episode ended ignominiously, but leaving at least a trace on older maps of Madisonville itself. The story that Noah tells is, of course, a very different one. It's about ultimately the global, the very unlikely and indeed unpredictable and probably unpredicted success of both James Madison and his various innovations. He traces this through 3 lives, as the subtitle of the book has it, and as he's already explained. And I just want to reflect for a moment about the process of writing the book in that mode. As we all know, lives do not have arguments. Lives are lived forward, chaotically, along multiple paths. Many of us, or some of us, try to shape the course of those lives, but in and of themselves, they do not have arguments. The dilemma of any biographer, therefore, and it is a very acute and steep dilemma, is whether or not to equip a biographical study, a soup to nuts, cradle to grave, or cradle to grave and legacy after the grave study with an argument. And I think it's particularly appropriate in the case of Madison to endow retrospectively the chaotic, forward-looking, contingent and groping messiness of a human life with an argument, because as Noah shows, especially in the first third of the book, when Madison is more the man of reflection than the man of action that he will become. Madison was very aware, as indeed were many of the founders, of their potential legacies, of the importance of the moment at which they were acting, indeed of the potentially universal, we might now translate this as global implications of their activities on the behalf of humanity or of mankind, that they were being watched by the world, and what they did and what they created could potentially have a global effect. And the backward-looking Madison of the early phase, backward-looking only in the precise sense of someone who did his researches and put any dilemma, particularly political and legal dilemmas, into a longue durée context, often going back to the ancient Greeks. We see in the first third of the book Madison, the great researcher, the author, for example, of the remarkable paper on ancient and modern confederacies, trying to place the punctual moment of the present into the long perspective of the past with all available knowledge. This was a man who was thinking about his own moment as, if not a culmination, at least a pivotal turning point in nothing less than world history. Even if that was the history of, as it were, the Mediterranean and Atlantic world at that point, but with implications potentially for generations as yet unborn, as well as the whole globe at the time. We see the unfolding of this man who is situating his own moment, his own life, into these longer arguments and longer processes, unfolding in such a way that, again, I think it's appropriate in this case, as in relatively few other cases, to endow an individual, punctual human life with an argument, and to draw conclusions looking back upon that life about its shape and its meaning. And I came into the book, as I often come into biographies, skeptical about the possibility of dividing a life into phases, endowing them with significance, and segmenting that human life into moments which could be seen as cumulative building blocks within an argument. But I came away from the book both deeply impressed with the detailed research. There is no important, and indeed many less unimportant episodes which gain in importance because of their organization within to the larger weft of the book itself that's untreated within the biography itself. And I think this the book therefore rises to the two great challenges of any biography. One is to give it a shape which does not seem externally imposed or unidiomatic or untrue to the life itself. In this case, this is someone who I think, if he were writing his own biography, would have assented to Noah's divisions and to the significance that he endows with them. But I also think, as a very humble historian, that I've not yet been tested by a biography. That's the greatest test of any historian, and you're much too modest in saying that you're not functioning as a very prominent historian of the early Republic and the early 19th century US in a global context now, Noah. I think this is a major achievement of a work to have synthesized so much material, to have dealt delicately with so many controversial issues in the context of a book which is genuinely a page-turner, which again allows one to follow the life of Madison as it was being lived without too many sentiments of where it might go or what its significance might be, but to do that also in such a way that by the end of the book the reader is fully convinced of not just the shape of the life but also, more importantly, of its significance as well. So I just wanted to end with three possibilities, hopes possibly about where you might go next from this. One very important thread of the book, which is made quite explicit in the first part, but provides a very important structural device in the second and third parts, is the thread within the book which one might describe as a history of political friendship in the late 18th century. I think this is a wonderfully rich approach to not only Madison's personal relationships, but also how he conducted his political relationships, especially with major characters like Monroe and Hamilton and Jefferson, for instance, as you show in particularly in this, the last two-thirds of the book. But there is buried within the texture of the book itself a very important study, I think, of the revision and the reimagining of friendship in a political context in the late 18th century, which could be drawn out in independent studies, of which Madison would simply be one part, but a very important part. I think you've shown that very significantly. The second might be the promise that's laid out actually in the very last pages of the book, the very final paragraphs of the book, where you state very challengingly, possibly controversially, that the major theme that emerges from Madison's life and accounts for its significance is that he invented the modern ideal of an invented federal constitution. I quote you here, a liberty-protecting constitutional government, and here's the perhaps controversial gauntlet thrown down, the most influential American idea in global political history. It may indeed be the most important political idea of the modern era. As we used to say on British examination papers, discuss. And I hope that possibly that might challenge you to think about a follow-up book on that, really, as it were, to cash out that claim, not specifically about Madison, but to tell us more, as it were, about the importance of that idea on a global scale, and to calibrate that against other potential candidates for the role of most important political idea of the modern era. I also hope, just in conclusion, that you might, at some point, maybe not immediately, return to the art of biography as well. I think you are an extraordinarily skilled and compelling biographer now. You've passed that important hurdle. But the biggest challenge of all might be to write the biography of someone whom you do not admire or for whom you do not feel sympathy. We all would think here, for example, of Bernard Bailyn's great biography of Thomas Hutchinson, that the real challenge is to imaginatively inhabit the world, the life of someone with whom you do not feel instant sympathy and whose significance one might wish to downplay, to put it very mildly. And maybe that will be the ultimate challenge at some point, is to face writing a biography of someone detestable, though important, rather than someone who is friendly, companionable, almost entirely admirable within the limits of his own times, of course, and, as you've shown, I think, in magisterial fashion, undoubtedly significant, not just for an American audience, but for a global audience as well. So thank you once again for the gift of this remarkable recreation of a remarkable life.
It's first of all a pleasure to be able to participate in this event. Noah served as a discussant at a similar symposium for a recent book of mine. I was reflecting on this as it occurred to me that that book was 250 pages. So I look forward to Noah's attendance at my next 3 book panels. But it is... it's an extraordinary book, and I have to say, in a way that I didn't expect, it challenged very deeply my somewhat unreflective commitments and sort of predispositions about how to do the history of political thought in this period. I want to maybe use my few minutes just to sort of explain that, and then just raise a few quibbles, just in the spirit of the occasion.
law school.
The way that the sort of intervention, which is I think very powerful but subtle, goes something like this. So when we think about the history of political thought, which is what I notionally do, when we say, as is very common to say now, that we have to put theorists in their context, we have to reconstruct their context so that we can understand the intentions of their work, the way in which they're intervening in existing debates, what it is they're trying to accomplish, in order to give a good historical account of what their interventions are, we need to reconstruct their context. And usually what we mean when we say that we have to reconstruct their context is a discursive context. We want to reconstitute the sort of ocean of texts, pamphlets, books, interventions that they're responding to sort of decode what it is they're doing and to put them in dialogue with others and understand that sentence A in paragraph B is actually a move in relation to this pamphlet that was doing something different or using this concept but deploying it in a slightly different way and so on. So that tends to be the sort of MO, and the idea is to show, in a way, the extent to which these different figures are using, deploying, and then criticizing a common language and a set of common kind of tropes, topoi, and all the rest. And what Noah shows in this book is that is a singularly unpromising way of reconstructing the context of James Madison, or at least the context through which we should understand the content of his important interventions in political theory. And this is something that I think many of us who've worked on the period have noticed. Madison is a very, very strange figure. He seems to stand almost outside of the discursive norms and conventions of the time. There are often attempts to argue that it was Adams who was the odd man out, or Hamilton who was the odd man out in relation to particular claims that they made or ideas that they held. But actually, in terms of their participation in a recognizable discourse or kind of set of discursive traditions and practices, the one who stands out is Madison. As I say, those of us who've worked on this material have had to struggle with this in various different ways. My own struggles have had to do more with the first third of the book, Madison's first life, where it's always been a point of amazement for me that Madison seems to have been very uninterested in the American Revolution. That is, the first sort of extended comments we ever find him making about the Revolution and the constitutional conflict with Britain come in 1774, so very, very late. Now, part of that's a matter of his age, but if you think about Hamilton, in 74, he was already publishing his pamphlets in response to Samuel Seabury, very much responding to a whole set of other pamphlets and arguments that had been made throughout the colonies and in Britain itself. He had a very cosmopolitan sort of perspective and was intervening very recognizably in that set of debates. Madison didn't. And in essence, and that has sort of jarring and sort of strange ramifications. So one sort of minor point that Noah very rightly makes early in the book is to say that Madison's first comments in relation to the revolutionary crisis were provoked by his sort of accidentally getting his hands on a text by Josiah Tucker, the sort of English divine and writer. And he writes in a letter that having read Tucker, who's trying to defend the claim that Parliament has some jurisdiction over America, he concludes that actually, malgré soi, Tucker has convinced him of the opposite, that actually he makes the case so badly that Madison is prepared to conclude that actually Parliament has no jurisdiction over America. This is 1774, so the Patriot movement had reached that conclusion 5 years earlier at least, if not 6. And so the fact that Madison is sort of standing outside of that tradition is very striking. And one could give many more examples. And in essence, Noah gives, I think, or at least I would characterize one of the implications of the book, is to give a more generic answer or solution to that puzzle, and to say that actually Madison is not the kind of figure whose political thought is best studied contextually in the discursive sense of contextualism, but in a different sense, where what we're interested in the case of Madison, is much more his life than the sort of field of discourse in which he was swimming, because he wasn't really swimming in it. In fact, one of the striking things about Madison is the degree to which he excluded himself, removed himself from those oceans, sometimes very intentionally, in these prolonged periods of withdrawal and kind of private meditation. But for Noah, I think, Madison's context is politics, and in a very particular way. And I think he helps us to see what is strikingly unusual, completely idiosyncratic about Madison. And that is, he was the first career politician in this country. And that was his identity. That was how he saw himself. And that makes him unlike any of the other major figures. So obviously, Washington and Hamilton would have seen themselves first and foremost as soldiers. Hamilton then as, well, whatever he was. Adams and Wilson, first and foremost, as kind of British lawyers, using that career as leverage to sort of mobilize in the sort of political contests in which they found themselves. And one could go on. Certainly, Franklin would have seen himself, and Jefferson, primarily as a citizen of the Republic of Letters, in a way that Noah is very good in highlighting the degree to which that was not true of Madison. Madison did not think of himself as a man of letters, as a kind of philosophe who was, sort of exploring the realm of the mind and all of its pursuits with his peers. He was doing politics, and his horizon was always very, very practical. And his reflections on these issues were always motivated by very specific political questions. There's a particular duty. We want to understand if it poses a threat to the Union. Well, that's going to lead me to think about constitutional structures. There's a particular question about the urgency of our finances. That's going to lead me to think in a different way about such and such a thing. That's very, very different from these other figures. He's approaching these questions very differently. So one way of putting that is to say that, we've recently been hearing a lot about the sort of the return of political theory. This is political history of political thought, as opposed to sort of intellectual or discursive history of political thought. And in the case of Madison, it clearly works. That's one dimension of the life. The other, I think, is the sort of capital L life, and that's what's maybe the most interesting and surprising revelation of the book, is the degree to which it is important to understand Madison that he was, again, unlike any of these other figures, a bachelor who didn't have to run his family estate in the formative period of the first third of the book. He had a living father who was doing that. And so he had none of the other entanglements and preoccupations that these other figures had. He was just doing this. And the medium through which he thought about his sort of political approach to political theory was, as David pointed out, in the context of these extraordinary political friendships. And he only had political friendships in this later period. So unlike the very early period that Noah talks about when he's at Princeton, after Princeton, his only close friends are friends with whom he is engaged in the political sphere and with whom he's discussing these particular and specific issues of legislative design, constitutional design, lawmaking, and so on. And Noah, I think, makes a very strong implicit case that that's the right way to think about Madison's very peculiar context. And the way in which he's rather doing his own thing in very striking ways that would seem very strange to someone who was trying to reassemble his context discursively, where often we sort of hit a brick wall. I mean, in that respect, the exceptions really are the ones that prove the rule. So when he gets to the Federalist and he starts writing about the new government as feudal, in structure rather than federal or confederal. There, you finally exhale and you say, oh, thank God, he's actually talking like Adams, like Hamilton, like all of these other people who are reading Smith and thinking about feudal confederacies and all the rest. But it's precisely the rarity of those moments that sort of calls attention to them. So I think that's at least for me what was the really provocative contribution of the book. Quibbles. On some of the and I say quibbles, they're really friendly amendments, and because Noah was really pushing me to think about how original some of these arguments that Madison is known for making actually were. And what I found myself thinking sometimes is that I might dissent modestly from a very strong claim about originality, but still give the man credit for doing something very different with a received idea. So, for instance, I don't think it's true that the federal negative is his idea, or that it was a new idea. The federal negative is structurally the idea of a kind of central legislature that would wield the negative in relation to the kind of subsidiary legislatures was a constitutional picture that was deployed pretty often in the early 1770s in the context of the imperial crisis by people trying to imagine how it might be resolved by creating an imperial federal legislature. And it was a kind of recognizable move in that set of arguments to say that the legislature should inherit the negative of the crown, so that the federal legislature should be using a negative to sort of at the center of a kind of federal arrangement of different dominion legislatures. But where I think you're right is that although the device in this context was not new, its purpose, the purpose that Madison assigned it really was. No one in 74, 75, whether it's or even earlier, Bancroft, Galloway, these other people who were thinking along these lines, no one ever thought of it as a device for the protection of minorities. They thought of it as simply the institution of what they called a pervading power, a kind of harmonizing power. And they were thinking of it particularly in relation to trade, that if you were going to have these individual dominion legislatures sort of doing their own thing, you needed someone keeping them all on side, making sure that they weren't at cross purposes and that they were maintaining some kind of balance of trade, and that's why you wanted the negative. So I think, and maybe this is my pitch, I think very often he's taking received ideas and retooling them and applying them in different ways, getting something new out of them. And I think that's equally true of the extend the sphere argument, where I think the debt, not only to Hume, whom you talk about, but also to Smith, in particular in relation to religious sects, is there, but again, repurposed and given a very different kind of coherence. And also, and this is where I'll end, the problem of faction. So one of the things that Noah argues is that it's not only Madison's solution, as it were, to the problem that's a novel contribution, but his posing of the problem of tyrannical majorities, of kind of interested majorities in a republic as a kind of poison pill, this kind of sort of potentially fatal flaw in Republican governments, namely that if you take it as given, as Madison does, that you're not going to eliminate divergent interests, then what do you do about the possibility of a majority interest that will behave tyrannically? And here again, my instinct is to say it's not that Madison, the novel contribution isn't the sort of specification of the problem, because that problem had been, to say, just to give one example, had been, the central royalist criticism of Republican political theory and sort of small, kind of the beginnings of democratic political theory, precisely the idea that what it amounted to was the tyrannical rule of the majority in its own interests and running roughshod over the liberties and properties of subjects, which is why it was the monarch who was the great defender of the liberties of subjects. I think it's not so much that that's the novelty, but as it were, accepting the royalist critique of republicanism rather than attempting to reject it, and then trying to offer a solution to sort of domesticate it. which is how I would think of what the intervention is, building in some respects on earlier Republican theorists who had taken as given the ineradicability of different humors or factions or interests, but again, doing this with a kind of a novel and much more sophisticated sort of engagement with the material. So anyway, those would be my quibbles, such as they are. But I think it's a very important book, a very provocative book, and also just we can't repeat enough, just a terrific read. I mean, it's extremely well written. It's very judicious. You avoid the temptation of going native in your subject, which is the occupational hazard of biographies, particularly, I find, of American founders. That is, it seems impossible to read a biography of, Franklin, where Adams isn't a tin pot dictator and Hamilton isn't Caesar, and and then vice versa. You read the Adams biography, and then Franklin is a lush, and the ability to sort of give a fair sort of shake to each of these figures, and to notice, as you do particularly, I think, in the excellent discussion of the bank, being willing to show where Madison is behaving disingenuously and arguing sort of spuriously, and so it's extremely fair-minded and rich, and you should all read it.
Okay, as the law school member of the panel, I wish to incorporate by reference everything that's been said so far. It is, as everyone here has said, really a remarkable accomplishment, and I hadn't quite realized until I read it what it was that made the match of biographer and subject in this case such a particularly appropriate and felicitous match. And to do that, in part, let me sort of step back a little bit and sort of talk about the genre as it applies to biographies of the founders. Many of you have doubtless heard the phrase founders chic. And it became popularized, maybe about 20 years or so ago, when you had a spate of biographies of members of the founding generation, written for general audiences, but by biographers who were themselves quite learned people. In this literary genre of founders chic, it was often fascinating for as much for what we learned about the subjects as what we learned about the biographers. I mean, certainly for dealing with biographies of prominent people, particularly those figures that have been written about in successive generations, you see different interpretations of the subject that reflect in large part in effect, the political, social milieu of the time of the biographer. And I remember when I was in graduate school, the sequence that we studied was successive biographies of Oliver Cromwell, which had him ranging anywhere from this enlightened figure to a 1930s era fascist. And again, depending upon the politics and period of the biographer. With the founder chic, it's interesting to see who gets written about first. Putting aside the multi-volume biographies that were written in the from the late 30s into the early 60s, whether it was Dumas Malone's The Multi-Volume Biography of Jefferson or Irving Brandt's multi-volume biography of the Madison. It's the later sequence. Jefferson, of course, has always attracted a lot of attention. In part because everyone is attracted to Jefferson's contradictions. Which part of the contradictions they emphasize, whether it is the Declaration of Independence Jefferson or it's the slave voting Jefferson, if it is the Jefferson the estate, or Jefferson the debtor, with someone like Jefferson. Reading the biographies, are often put in mind of the proverb of the blind men examining the elephant. They each sort of grab onto a particular piece, through their limited senses, examine the hell out of that piece. But Jefferson provided material for it. With Benjamin Franklin, it was because he was his own self-presentation, self-creation of the figure, from the humble printer to the very learned man who wore homespun and charmed the hell out of large numbers of people. He also provided an appealing individual, the subject. Madison, it sort of effectively has been left for last among the members of the founding generation to attract treatment of this kind. And I think in part part of it is associated with what Eric mentioned, that he was not as interested in or as involved in the revolution. Of course, with Washington, you have this great soldier. With Jefferson, you have the author of the Declaration of Independence. Even with John Adams, you have this figure who is deeply involved in the political arguments for independence. But as mentioned, Madison was younger. But yes, Hamilton was younger too. But Hamilton was a soldier. And it was the sort of the multiplicity of Hamilton's the personality and his intellect that would ultimately attract what was for the founder chic, the ultimate treatment, of course, which is that by Lin-Manuel Miranda. But with Madison, I think perhaps the impediment to there not having been a treatment of this kind before, is in part because of to understand Madison, you really do have to understand the Constitution, and you have to understand constitutional law. And that is simply the starting point, and which is why I think in part the pairing of the subject and biographer here is particularly appropriate, and in retrospect an inevitable pairing, because as Noah mentioned, he approaches this as a scholar of constitutional law, and he has thought about it deeply. He's thought about it for a long time. He's written about it, in that sense, this is kind of the ultimate originalist biography, because of the way he does get inside the Madison's contributions to the Constitution and his commitment to it. And so it would not have been possible to write about James Madison without having the familiarity with the Constitution that Noah does. And quite frankly, none of the other authors who have the contributed volumes on the founders, had that kind of knowledge or understanding of the Constitution. As superb historians as many of them were, not all, but many, none was a lawyer, none had studied the Constitution either, with the understanding of its origins that Noah does, because I think to understand it, you have to understand its subsequent history as well. The second part that I think turns out to be key to understanding Madison, and I think is part of what makes, again, the pairing of biographer and subject so effective in this case, is the extent to which Madison learned to become a politician. And I mean, then this echoes, Eric's comment about Madison being the first real politician. And as I read the book, I watched Madison acquiring political skills. I suppose some people are born with political skills, but not very many. But on the other hand, you can learn them. You just have to be aware. You just have to learn to understand people. You have to try to figure out what motivates them. And in the course of Noah's book, you watch Madison learning political skills until he becomes a very, very good politician. And it really is quite remarkable to watch. And we often think today, when the word politician is used as an epithet, of politicians as being unprincipled people who are solely interested in advancing either their own interests or the interests of the people, their constituents, or their handlers, you name it. But in reality, the politicians who have the most enduring impact are those who do adhere to principles, who do have ideals, who do have a larger vision, who, when they do make compromises, as all politicians must, they still adhere to the principles, and they can distinguish between what is core and what is not. And that is what you see Madison doing, and doing so very effectively. And I think and also in this, to echo in part what David had mentioned, the role of friendship, which is very powerful, and one that I had not really appreciated before. It's particularly interesting with, I think, Madison and Hamilton, and it's interesting in part because the two, in so many ways, were so very much alike. The ferociously intelligent men, who were widely read, and who tried to influence the world around them in the only way they knew how, which is through their writing and their arguing. Hamilton was probably more feverishly devoted to that than Madison, and more driven. But in a sense, I got the feeling in reading this that it was in part the very similarities that ultimately drove them apart. and not simply that they wound up on opposite sides of the political divide. And so but I think that the appreciation of Madison as a politician, and what one could accomplish with political skills, something that I know that Noah has an appreciation for as well, because I also know Noah as an astute commentator on the current political issues, often with their constitutional dimension. But Noah has always been very good at interweaving the constitutional and the political, and I think that that is something that shows itself very powerfully in the book. And so it is those two pieces that I think were essential, and certainly after reading this book, are essential to understanding Madison. And I think they're the particular the skills that Noah brings it to, or his basis for understanding the subject. Now I think for I imagine as David was saying, that the thinking of other things that Noah could take up from this, I could also imagine Noah saying, look at this, and said, I gave 7 years of my life to this already. There is no way I'm going to do it.
The Middle East isn't working out that well.
That may be. And so and also and David did point out that part of the dilemma with biographers, the question of personal sympathy. It would be hard to spend that much time with someone you did not like. There has never been, for example, an adequate biography of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., great justice of the Supreme Court. And in part, it appears one of the reasons is that the biographers who have tried, when they dig deep into his papers, really can't stand the man. And so when Mark DeWolf Howe, who was on this faculty, in the 40s, 50s, was tackling a biography of Holmes. He was in the library, and this weazened old historian came up to him, who found out what Howe was working on, and said and just said, Holmes has killed many an historian, beware. and then Howe died. And then Howe died. Right, exactly. And so it's probably better to stick to subjects that you like. It's free, but this is it's a remarkable accomplishment, and I said I think it is the various entries into the genre of founder chic. To me, it's clear why treatment Madison had to wait this long. And effectively, it had to wait for someone with Noah's combination of skills and insight to come along. And to echo what my colleagues have said, I mean, you look at the size. To call it a page turner, you could look at it and say, well, there are a lot of pages to turn. But it is wonderfully written, and will repay study for a long time to come.
Thank you. I'm extremely grateful to all three of you, among other things, for reading the entire book and engaging with it. And I just thought I would just say very briefly, In response, I accept all of the quibbles, I think, as true. I accept the analysis of why I was a reasonable fit with Madison. I wouldn't say I was constantly in sympathy with him. Among other things, he has a style of writing that tends towards the indirect. And the more complicated something becomes, especially personally, the more abstract he gets. He's a deeply repressed human being. And having written a book in which Felix Frankfurter was one of the four main characters, I've had the experience of someone who was both, I both identified with him and also saw enormous flaws in him. He's, by the way, the person who assigned the Holmes biography to Howe, that killed Howe. But the great thing about Frankfurter is how unrepressed he was. You know, whatever was on his mind at that moment, he would immediately put it to paper or say it to somebody. So in that sense, you know, I've had the experience of writing about someone where it was on the page. In the case of Madison, it's always between the lines. And that is challenging over a long period of time. I just want to say, because I know there are a lot of law students in the room, that partly writing a book in this genre that historians and historians of political thought can respond to is meant as a statement also about what constitutional law can be. Constitutional law involves, first of all, people who are not lawyers, like Madison. Madison flirted repeatedly with actually qualifying himself as a common lawyer, but in the end, he never did it. And as Eric pointed out, that's partly because he had become a career politician and he didn't need to do it. It's also that, as Eric also mentioned, he inherited a plantation, and so he didn't have the financial need to go out and become a lawyer. But ultimately, it was that he self-conceived himself as a statesman who would teach himself as much law as he needed. And once in a while, that went awry. I mean, when he was Secretary of State, Henry, you'll appreciate this, he tried to write a book of international law. It's his longest book. It's about 200 pages. It's unreadably bad and not very convincing, mostly because you can see himself trying to learn international law as he went. And as someone who once tried to teach myself international law as I went, it's a very, very hard thing to do, and it shows that you don't really know what you're doing as you do it. So, first of all, constitutions are so important that they should not be left to the lawyers, and are not left to the lawyers in the real world. Second, constitutions engage ideas, and they engage ideas in a very particular way. They engage ideas, and this very much, I think, came out in the comments that each of you made, they engage ideas on the political dimension. It's a lovely idea to imagine writing a constitution behind a veil of ignorance, but it's also utterly incomprehensible, because real human beings writing a real constitution couldn't possibly do so behind a veil of ignorance other than the inevitable ignorance about the future that's real. If you knew nothing about who was going to fill the jobs that you were designing, you would not be able to design a constitution at all. If you limited the drafting of a constitution to people who weren't going to play a role in the future state, or at least knew they weren't, you would be excluding the most effective and intelligent politicians from designing the document that was designed to facilitate active politics. So all constitutions everywhere are actually drafted not against the backdrop of ignorance, but against the backdrop of constant updating of information and guessing about how the politics of the given polity in the future are being shaped in the moment. So the second point here for you law students is that constitutions are about ideas, and those ideas are political ideas, and they're in constant engagement with actual real-world politics. And that never stops, right? That's the way in which, in a way, it's an originalist. It's a biography for originalists, but it is not an originalist biography because we see Madison's conception of the Constitution fundamentally transformed in the years after he led the process of its drafting. So it calls into question, in that sense, the idea of what originalism could mean, because if you think it means what the Constitution's public meaning was when it was ratified, within a couple of years, the people most involved in it did no longer believe that it meant the things that they had been saying publicly, and I think indeed privately believing that it meant previously. Last but not least, constitutions are made by human beings who engage on dimensions of human interaction. And this brings us to the friendship point that all of you mentioned. And in fact, my working title for the book was Friends and Enemies in the early Republic. And then someone said to me, maybe you should call the book Frenemies. And I thought that was maybe a bad idea. But the notion of political friendship and the capacity of human beings to form political friendships and indeed to become enemies which is one of the things that happens in a true friendship. There is the possibility of becoming a true enemy. And at some point, Madison and Hamilton went from being true political friends to true political enemies in the deepest Schmittian sense of the term, is that those friendships are simultaneously in the realm of ideas, in the realm of formation of alliances, and still exist at the human level. So, and I'll close with this, James Monroe, who was one of Madison's closest friends in his life, right up there with Jefferson, and a constant ally and a rough contemporary, twice tried to destroy Madison's political career by running against him at crucial junctures. He tried to run against him after Madison, believe it or not, had just gotten the Constitution ratified in Virginia. He tried to run against him for the House in a gerrymandered district, gerrymandered by Patrick Henry. And had he won, Madison's political career would have been in serious, serious trouble. I don't know if it would have been over, but it would have been in very, very bad trouble. Then he ran against Madison again when Madison ran for president. And in each instance, the idea was, we're friends, but I'm taking you down. And in each instance, Madison rather extraordinarily insisted, well, this is political, it's not personal. Now, that was both true in the sense that Madison tried very hard to transcend the political division, and a noble lie, a fiction designed to try to preserve a friendship that mattered deeply to him. And then when he was president, after being saddled with a terrible Secretary of State, Madison turned around and he hired James Monroe as his Secretary of State. And this was in part a great political act and an act of political alliance. It was also that he badly needed a good Secretary of State. But above all else, he also needed a friend. He sought after that actual human connection. That's always a dimension of our existence. And I know we do everything we can here at Harvard Law School to drum out of you the idea that the law ought to reflect or express human connections. But it does, it will, and ultimately it should. So on that note, I want to thank my colleagues and my friends, David, Eric, and Bruce, for participating today, and thank all of you so much for coming and participating. Thank you. Please join me in giving a round of applause to the panelists.